The air at my mom's funeral was thick with lilies and grief. At least, it was for most people. As I stood by her casket, my hand on the cool wood, I saw them, my own family, smiling. It wasn't a sad, nostalgic smile. It was a smug, triumphant grin. The kind of people wear when they think they've just won. My Aunt Carol, my Uncle Mark, and their detestable children were huddled together, not sharing comfort, but celebrating a victory. They were celebrating my mother's death, because it meant they could finally get their hands on my inheritance. And in that one soul-crushing moment, hearing their quiet, cruel laughter in a room meant for sorrow, I decided I'd give them a real reason to cry. This is the story of how I used their greed to burn their world to the ground. My world revolved around my mom, Alina. She wasn't just a parent, she was my best friend. For the last 5 years of her life, we fought her illness side by side. It was a slow, grueling battle that chipped away at her body, but never, ever touched her spirit. She was kind, almost too generous, and had this quiet grace that my dad's side of the family, the Vultures, just couldn't understand. My dad died when I was young, and he left my mom with a surprisingly large portfolio of investments and properties. He was a savvy man who made sure his wife and daughter would always be taken care of. My mom managed this inheritance wisely, growing it steadily. She never lived a lavish life. Her joys were simple: her garden, our Sunday talks, and helping others. Her brother, my Uncle Mark, and his wife, my Aunt Carol, were the exact opposite. They lived a life of smoke and mirrors, always chasing a lifestyle they couldn't afford. Mark was a man of grand, failed business ideas, each one funded by a new loan he could barely get. Carol's self-worth was stitched into the labels of her clothes. Their kids, my cousins Tom and Jessica, were just like them, believing the world owed them everything and that my mother's money was a family piggy bank they were just waiting to smash open. Throughout Mom's illness, their concern was a bad stage play. They'd visit with cheap flowers and hollow sympathies, but their eyes would wander around the house, taking inventory of the art and antique furniture. Their questions were never about her pain, they were about her finances. "Is everything in order, Alina?" Uncle Mark would ask, his voice dripping with fake concern. "You must be so worried about leaving things complicated for your daughter." What he meant was, "Did you make sure we got our cut?" Mom saw right through it, of course. She wasn't stupid. "They're like crows on a fence wire," she told me once, her voice weak but her eyes sharp. "Just waiting." I'd squeeze her hand and tell her not to worry, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. It's one thing to be sick, it's another to know your family is counting down the days. In her final weeks, the visits got more frequent. Aunt Carol would help by sorting through Mom's closets, remarking on which jewelry Jessica would just love. Uncle Mark would pitch his latest can't-miss investment, a pathetic hint for cash that never came. They treated her dying like it was a business deal, and they were ready to close. I played my part, offering them tea and polite smiles, while a knot of cold rage tightened in my stomach. I was losing the most important person in my life, and they were circling like predators. I held on to the memory of my mother's dignity in the face of their greed, and I promised myself I would honor her. I just didn't know how yet, but the funeral, that's when everything became crystal clear. The day of the funeral was a gray, somber blur. Friends who had genuinely loved my mom filled the pews, their shared grief like a warm blanket. But my family stood apart, an island of ill-fitting solemnity. As I gave the eulogy, my voice cracking, I talked about my mother's kindness and her laugh. I glanced over and saw Uncle Mark check his watch. Aunt Carol was whispering to Jessica, who stifled a giggle. The disrespect was so blatant it took my breath away. But the moment that truly broke me came later, at the reception at my mother's house. I was standing near the living room, talking to one of her old friends when I heard them. My aunt, uncle, and cousins were by the fireplace, thinking they were out of earshot, drinking my mother's expensive wine. "The lawyer said next week, right?" Uncle Mark said a little too loudly. "Yes, finally," Carol sighed dramatically. "God, it's been such a long wait. Poor Alina, she held on, didn't she?" It wasn't said with sympathy. It was said with the exhaustion of someone waiting for a delayed flight. Then Jessica chimed in, her voice shrill. "I can finally get that new convertible, and that trip to Europe Dad promised." "Don't spend it all in one place," Mark chuckled. We need to clear my debts first. Then we can talk about upgrading the house. They were carving up my inheritance before my mother was even in the ground. They weren't just greedy, they were ghouls feasting on our tragedy. And then I saw it. The smiles, broad, genuine smiles of relief. They clinked their glasses in a quiet toast, a toast to my mother's death. In that moment, something inside me just snapped. The grief didn't vanish, it just transformed. It turned cold, sharp, and clear. It turned into rage, a silent, glacial rage that froze my tears and settled deep in my bones. I didn't storm over. I didn't scream. That's what they would have wanted so they could paint me as hysterical. No, I just watched them, etching their smiling faces into my memory. I turned away, a ghost in my own home, and a plan began to form. They wanted a reason to cry. I would give them an ocean of tears. The week between the funeral and the will reading was the longest week of my life. I was in a fog of grief and fury. My family, of course, tried to help. Aunt Carol would call, saying how overwhelmed I must be and offering to organize my mother's things. It was a pathetic attempt to get inside the house and start claiming their prizes. I told them no, my voice a flat line. The day of the will reading came. We all sat in the stuffy office of my mother's lawyer, Mr. Harrison. My relatives were practically buzzing with excitement. Mr. Harrison, a kind man who'd known my family for years, began to read. To my brother Mark and his wife, Carol, I leave my fondest memories and the hope that they find happiness not in material wealth, but in the family they have. Silence. Aunt Carol's smile twitched. Uncle Mark looked confused. And to my beloved daughter, Mr. Harrison continued, his voice softening, who has been my rock, my joy, and my greatest legacy, I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes all properties, liquid assets, investment portfolios, and personal effects. The total value of the estate is estimated at approximately $8 million. The sound that came out of Aunt Carol was half gasp, half choke. Uncle Mark's face turned a blotchy, furious red. "What? That's impossible," he sputtered. "We're her family." "She considered her daughter her family," Mr. Harrison said calmly. "The will is ironclad. There is also a handwritten letter from Alina explaining her decision." He slid an envelope to me. My family stared, their faces masks of raw fury. "This is an outrage," Carol shrieked. "That girl manipulated her. She was sick. She wasn't in her right mind." "On the contrary," Mr. Harrison said, his tone firm. "Alina was perfectly lucid. Her letter explains that her decision was based on years of observing your anticipation for her passing. She decided her life's work would be best entrusted to someone who valued her, not her bank account." Driving home, the letter sat on the passenger seat. I walked into the empty house and sank onto the living room floor. Her elegant handwriting filled the page. She wrote about her love for me, her pride. And then she wrote about the family, how their greed had broken her heart. "Don't let them bully you, my love," she wrote. "This money is not a gift, it is a tool. It is your security, your freedom. Use it to build a life they can only dream of. That will be my true legacy." Reading her words was the final push. The grief was still there, a hollow ache, but now it had a partner, purpose. This wasn't just about money, it was about justice for my mother. I hit rock bottom on that floor, but I didn't feel broken. I felt like a weapon being forged. I went from a grieving daughter to the architect of a quiet, calculated war. I spent the next few days not just mourning, but studying every financial document my mother left behind. The harassment started almost immediately. Voicemails filled with threats, emails demanding their rightful share. Their desperation only fueled my resolve. I hired a new, aggressive legal team, a sharp financial advisor, and a private investigator. I told the PI to dig into every corner of my uncle's life. "I want to know where every penny he owes is buried," I told him. My mother said the money was a tool. It was time to start using it. My revenge would be silent, legal, and absolute. It would be death by 1,000 cuts. The PI's first report was a masterpiece of financial ruin. Uncle Mark wasn't just in debt, he was drowning. He had high-interest loans from shady lenders and was a house of cards waiting for a slight breeze. He had been counting on my mother's money as a life raft to save him from total annihilation. The first move was simple. One of Mark's largest private loans was from a small investment firm. Through a holding company I set up, I bought his debt at a premium. The firm got their money, and I became my uncle's new creditor. I didn't call him. I just had my lawyers send a standard, legally mandated notification. The letter was cold, corporate, and terrifying. It informed him that Argent Solutions LLC was his new creditor and that payment terms would be strictly enforced. He had no idea Argent Solutions was his niece. Next, I targeted his home. I found out the second mortgage on their gaudy house was held by a regional bank. Again, through my holding company, I purchased the debt. I now own the paper on the house Aunt Carol was so desperate to renovate. The third, and most satisfying, move involved a small, half-empty strip mall he owned. He was trying to evict a lovely elderly woman who ran a bookstore there. So, I bought the entire building through another anonymous LLC. The first thing I did was visit the bookstore owner. I introduced myself as a rep for the new management company and told her that not only was her lease secure, I was lowering her rent by 30%. The woman burst into tears of relief. Helping her in my mother's name felt right. For my uncle, the news came in another sterile corporate letter informing him the property had been sold. The tiny bit of equity he had was wiped out by his outstanding property taxes, which I had graciously paid and then billed him for. The fallout was gradual, then sudden. My uncle called the number on the Argent Solutions letterhead, which routed to a burner phone on my desk. "I need to speak to someone about the loan for Mark Thompson," he blustered. "I had an arrangement with the previous lender." "There is no mistake, Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice altered, professional and cold. "Payment is due on the 1st. There is no grace period." "You don't understand," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I just need a little more time." "Time is not something Argent Solutions extends," I replied, and I hung up. The calls got more desperate. They started selling things. Carol's jewelry, their luxury car. Jessica's convertible dream evaporated. They had to pull her out of her expensive private university. Their world was shrinking, the walls of their greed closing in. The final blow came when I foreclosed on their house. After 3 missed payments, the legal notices went up. The whole time, they raged against a faceless corporation, a cruel entity that had ruined them. They never once suspected that the unfeeling entity was the quiet, grieving girl they had smirked at during her mother's funeral. I decided the final act needed an audience. It was time to pull back the curtain. The day before the eviction, I called a family meeting. I didn't invite them. I called my grandmother, my father's mother, and told her I wanted to make peace and offer Mark and Carol some financial assistance. As I expected, she summoned the clan. My uncle and aunt arrived looking haggard, but with a flicker of hope. They thought I was finally cracking. We all sat in my grandmother's formal living room. My uncle launched into a speech about unfortunate business downturns and predatory lenders. Aunt Carol dabbed at her dry eyes. "We're just so glad you've come to your senses, dear," she sniffled. "Your mother would have wanted you to help us." I let them finish. Then I placed a single file folder on the coffee table. "My mother," I began, my voice quiet but firm, "wanted me to have a life free from the kind of greed that poisons people. She knew you were waiting for her to die. She knew you smiled at her funeral." Aunt Carol gasped, "How dare you?" "I dare because I was there," I said, my voice hardening. "I saw you. I heard you toasting to your new life funded by my loss." I opened the folder and pushed a letter from Argent Solutions LLC across the table. "Are you familiar with this company, Uncle Mark?" He stared at the letterhead, his face draining of color as it dawned on him. "What is this?" "That's the predatory lender who bought your debt," I explained calmly. "Argent Solutions. It's Latin, argentum, for silver. It's one of the companies I founded." I pushed another document toward him, the deed for his house. "And this is the company that holds the mortgage on your house. And this," I added, sliding the strip mall deed over, "is the company that now owns your failed business park. They all belong to me." The room was utterly silent. My aunt's face was a mess of shock and horror. My uncle looked like he'd been punched. You did this," he whispered, his voice hoarse. You ruined us." "No," I said, standing up. "You ruined yourselves. You built a life on debt and entitlement and were counting on a dead woman's money to save you. I simply bought the debt. The rest was just you failing, as you always do. My mother's money didn't ruin you. It just illuminated your ruin." I turned to my cousins. "There is no trip to Europe, Jessica. Your parents' greed has cost you everything." Aunt Carol let out a guttural sob, a real one this time, a raw, ugly wail of despair. My uncle just sat there, his mouth hanging open. My cousins were crying. They finally had a reason to cry. I picked up my folder. "The eviction is tomorrow. I suggest you start packing." I walked out of that house and didn't look back. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't broken the law. I had simply used the very thing they craved, money, to give them exactly what they deserved. The quiet revenge was complete. This journey was about more than revenge. It was about honoring my mother's memory. If you've ever felt underestimated or wronged, I hope this story gives you some satisfaction. Let me know in the comments what you think of how things turned out. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where justice is finally served. It's been 2 years. I never spoke to any of them again. I heard through the grapevine that they live in a small, rundown apartment across town. Mark works a menial job, and Carol's superficial friends vanished with the money. They are irrelevant, ghosts in a life they threw away. As for me, I followed my mother's advice. I used the money as a tool. I started a charitable foundation in her name that provides scholarships for young women in the arts. I sold her house, with its painful memories, and bought a smaller place for myself near the ocean. I didn't just survive. I built a life of peace and purpose. There are days when grief for my mother hits me like a wave, but it's no longer tinged with bitterness. I took their poison and created an antidote. They thought they could break me, but they underestimated my mother. Her greatest legacy wasn't the money, but the strength she instilled in me. The strength to fight back not with loud, ugly cruelty, but with quiet, unyielding resolve. They smiled at my mother's funeral, and in doing so, they handed me the shovel I used to bury them. And I have never felt freer.